Sarah Smith, 34, felt the strain of her existence pressed into the tired lines around her green eyes. She was a psychologist, a professional empath. Yet her own life was currently an unsolvable case study in stress and financial suffocation. The two-story walk-up in New Jersey offered thin walls against the cold October air and even thinner protection against the world she was trying desperately to keep at bay. The real problem wasn't the overdue rent. It was the lingering debt her deceased father had incurred, a reckless venture paid for with dirty money. The promissory note had been passed like a toxic baton, finally landing in the hands of the Solntsevskaya Bratva, the Russian syndicate. They didn't send politely worded letters. Leo, her 10-year-old son, was the only untainted piece of her world. He possessed her bright eyes and a keen intelligence that made him far too observant for his age. Tonight, he was hunched over a graphic novel in the small living room, the glow of the lamp creating an oasis of normalcy. Sarah watched him, savoring the fragile quiet, praying the storm would never break. It broke just after 11. It wasn't the polite knock of the landlord. It was a deafening, splintering blow against the cheap front door, followed immediately by the sound of wood shattering and hinges tearing free. Sarah screamed, a sound trapped in her throat, and shoved Leo into the narrow utility closet in the hallway. "Stay hidden, darling. Don't move, no matter what." The whispered command was fierce, infused with a primal, desperate love. She slammed the door shut just as the men entered. Two figures filled the small living room, large men in heavy dark coats that seemed too big for the space. They carried the oppressive scent of stale cigarettes and imminent violence. Their faces were brutal, their eyes cold. One of them, a mountain of muscle with a scarred eyebrow, grabbed Sarah by the arm, the force crushing her bones. "The debt is past due, Dr. Smith," the man hissed, his English heavily accented. His breath smelled of vodka and malice. "Your father's foolishness is now your problem. You come with us. Your unique skills will be payment." Sarah fought, twisting her arm, adrenaline surging. "My son is here. Let me go. I don't know anything about money. The boy is not our concern." The other man, taller and quieter, delivered a quick, sharp blow to her side. The shock stole her breath, forcing a small, choked gasp. They didn't wait for her to regain her composure. They dragged her through the splintered doorway and into the freezing night, shoving her into the back of a large black sedan that idled menacingly at the curb. The entire invasion took less than 90 seconds. The sedan peeled away, the sound of the tires squealing on the wet asphalt fading into the silence. Leo, curled beneath a pile of mismatched linens, waited until the vibration of the car engine had completely disappeared. His heart hammered a desperate, erratic rhythm against the flimsy wood of the closet door. He was terrified, tears hot and silent on his cheeks, but his mother's terrified whisper, "Stay hidden," was the only command he had ever fully obeyed. After what felt like an eternity, he crept out. The living room was a wreck. The front door an empty frame revealing the dark street. His mother was gone. He saw the hastily scribbled note he had left. The words, "Mama gone, I go get help," smeared with his tears. He knew he couldn't call the police. The men who took his mother were too fast, too dangerous. They were the bad men, the ones who operated outside the law. Leo needed someone who also operated outside the law, someone faster and stronger. He remembered the neighborhood whispers, the gossip shared by the delivery drivers and the elderly neighbors about the massive estate just 5 blocks away, the one surrounded by the impenetrable stone wall, the armed guards, and the surveillance cameras on every corner. They called it the fortress, the home of the Moratelli family, the Moratelli boss. It was a place of power, a place where ordinary rules did not apply. It was his only chance. 10-year-old Leo, driven by a desperate courage that dwarfed his small frame, slipped out through the empty doorway. He ran, not towards safety, but towards the epicenter of danger. The cold air burned his lungs, and the streetlights blurred his vision. But the image of his mother's terrified face fueled his small legs. 5 long blocks later, he stood before it. The monolithic stone wall of the Moratelli estate. The imposing iron gates looked like the entrance to a vault. Armed, impassive guards stood sentinel. Leo ignored the security features and began hammering his small fists against the cool, unforgiving metal. Inside the vast, opulent mansion, the air was thick with the scent of fine cigar smoke and old money. Vincenzo Moratelli, 35 years old, was concluding a tense strategic meeting with his capo regimes. His power was absolute, his control frighteningly complete. Vincenzo was physically imposing. A thick, strong chest under a tailor-made suit, dark hair, and those cold, penetrating blue ice eyes that rarely held any emotion but calculation. The deal is finalized. Grimaldiro is out, Vincenzo stated, his voice a low, gravelly command that demanded instant obedience. His head of security, Sergio, approached him from the side door, an unusual flicker of agitation crossing his usually stoic face. "Boss, there's a situation at the main gate. Not an incursion. It's a child." Vincenzo paused, the movement almost imperceptible. An interruption was an insult. A child was an anomaly. He descended the grand, sweeping marble staircase with a lethal grace, every movement economical and purposeful. He ordered the gates to be opened just enough for a visual confirmation. He saw the boy. Small, trembling, dressed in a faded jacket, eyes huge and bloodshot with tears. The raw, unfiltered panic radiating off the child was unlike anything Vincenzo encountered in his world of calculated risks and hidden agendas. Leo looked up at the towering man who stood framed by the light of the immense entryway. A figure of terrifying, yet undeniable strength. The words tore from his throat, ragged and desperate, the sound echoing off the stone walls. "Bad men took my mama. They have black cars. You have to help me." Vincenzo Moratelli's cold gaze settled on the boy's face. The plea was direct, the distress authentic. The Russian audacity to operate this close, to cause such a disruption, was unacceptable. But beneath the calculation, something flickered. A momentary softening in the blue ice depths, a recognition of absolute vulnerability. This was not a business proposition or a threat. This was a child's last hope. His decision was immediate, bypassing logic and fueled by an unfamiliar, territorial compulsion. "Bring the boy inside, now," Vincenzo commanded, his voice returning to its normal, absolute tone. The night's agenda had just shifted. The Moratelli organization was about to involve itself in a mother's rescue, and the Russians were about to regret every decision that led the boy to the boss's gate. The first step of the counterattack had just been ordered. Leo was inside the compound. Sarah was next. Vincenzo Moratelli did not possess the luxury of feeling. He possessed control. His response to the 10-year-old boy weeping at his gate was not compassion. It was calculation. He ushered Leo into the vast, soundproof silence of the foyer. The child's small, frantic footsteps swallowed instantly by the plush, custom-made rugs that lined the marble floor. The mansion, a testament to decades of inherited power and bloodshed, seemed to hold its breath. Vincenzo led Leo toward the rear of the main floor, bypassing the formal, imposing areas. He settled the boy in a smaller leather-bound study, a room designed for strategy and quiet cruelty, not comfort. The air was heavy with the scent of aged whiskey and the lingering metallic tang of tension from his recently concluded meeting. "You will tell me your name, and then you will tell me everything, without interruption," Vincenzo commanded. His voice a low, heavy chord that seemed to vibrate the expensive air. He did not shout. He did not need to. His authority was absolute, rooted in the cold, penetrating depth of his blue ice eyes. He signaled to Franco Fontanelli, one of his most trusted capo regimes, to remain in the doorway, a silent, armed sentinel. "I'm Leo." "Leo Smith," the boy managed, his voice still trembling, though the immediate fear of the street had been replaced by the paralyzing awe of his surroundings. Leo possessed a resilience that surprised Vincenzo. Most adults dissolved under the weight of his gaze. The child simply blinked and held his ground. "Good, Leo. Now, the men who took your mother. What did they say? What did they look like?" Leo recounted the terror with stark, chronological accuracy. He described the forced entry, the brutal, non-negotiable tone of the men, and crucially, the heavy Slavic accents. "They were big, Mr. Moratelli. And they kept saying something about my mom having to pay or use her brain to help them. She's a psychologist. And the car? Vincenzo pressed. Black. Big. An SUV, I think, but shiny. I remember the smell when they broke in. Like smoke and something cheap like bad aftershave. Vincenzo's jaw tightened, the muscle working under his tanned skin. The Solntsevskaya Bratva. They were crude, predictable. And their expansion into Moratelli territory was an act of war, an affront to the Calabrian honor that defined his organization. They had crossed a critical line, not just by seizing a civilian, but by doing so with a brazenness that suggested contempt for his authority. He rose, towering over the boy. The raw courage Leo displayed, running to the most dangerous man in the state to ask for help, was a silent testament to the mother's strength, a strength Vincenzo recognized and, against his will, respected. The mission to retrieve Sarah Smith, the 34-year-old psychologist, became instantly paramount. It was no longer a negotiation or a warning shot. It was an execution order. Franco, Vincenzo stated, his eyes fixed on the distant wall as he issued commands that would mobilize hundreds of men across the tri-state area. Seal the perimeter. No one leaves or enters without my express clearance. Activate the full intelligence network. I want immediate surveillance data on every known Russian holding site within a 100-mile radius. Use the accent and the car description. I want her retrieved, and I want every man responsible neutralized. This is a territorial violation, and the penalty is absolute. Vincenzo then turned back to Leo, kneeling once more. His face was a mask of cold resolve, but his voice carried a weight that transcended mere business. I promise you, Leo, I will find your mother. She will be safe here. You have my word. It was a silent oath, delivered not to a priest or a partner, but to a terrified child. The vow felt strangely grounding, a tether to an honor code that had nothing to do with crime, and everything to do with dominance and protection. He ensured Leo was comfortable, placing him under the direct, unwavering watch of Franco and several other trusted men. As the chaotic, precise mechanics of the Moratelli organization began to grind into action, hackers flooding the city's traffic feeds, informants risking their lives in freezing docks, Vincenzo retreated to his private office. He was already reviewing the initial report from the security detail that had inspected Sarah's apartment. The dossier was dry, detailing her financial struggle, her profession, and the destroyed front door. Then, he spotted the appendix. Personal effects recovered. He ordered the immediate retrieval of the items: a worn leather wallet, a set of keys, and 3 photographs. Within minutes, a messenger, breathless from the speed of the command, placed a sealed evidence bag on Vincenzo's massive mahogany desk. He ripped it open, his fingers, usually so precise, slightly clumsy with an unfamiliar sense of urgency. He examined the 2 recent smiling photos of Leo, then reached for the 3rd, older image. It was a small, faded photograph, the colors muted by age. It showed 3 children by the ocean. 2 boys, one older, tall and serious with dark hair, and one younger, slightly out of focus. And a girl. The girl was bright, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a genuine, unguarded smile, her light brown hair messy from the sea air. Vincenzo stared at the girl, then back at the cold, official file listing the name Sarah Smith. A powerful, disorienting wave of flashbacks hit him. It wasn't a gentle recall. It was a violent collision with his past. The smell of salt and sunblock. A relentless summer on Long Island, running through the dunes, trying to escape the watchful eyes of their parents. The endless days when they were just Vince and Sarah, building sandcastles together, sharing secrets about their terrifying, powerful families. Her laughter, bright, unfiltered, a sound that hadn't existed in his life since he was 15. The memory was so vivid, so visceral, it pulled the air from his lungs. He remembered the specific, heartbreaking day they were separated, a quick, cold farewell dictated by his family's need for him to fully embrace the Ndrangheta path. He had buried that life, brick by emotional brick, telling himself Vince was dead, and only Vincenzo Moratelli remained. Now, here she was. The same defiant green eyes, now haunted by fear, belonging to the victim of his rivals. Vincenzo felt a deep, seismic shift in his core. The territorial issue, the insult of the Solntsevskaya Bratva, faded into the background. This was no longer about power dynamics. It was about the personal. She was the ghost of his innocence, a living testament to the human heart he thought he had successfully calcified. A deep, chilling fury, unrelated to business, began to consume him. The Russians hadn't just trespassed. They had desecrated a sacred, buried piece of his history. They had kidnapped his Sarah, the girl who knew the boy before the boss. He grabbed the phone, his focus absolute. His initial orders were not strong enough. They were too broad. "Franco," he snapped, his voice a wire of concentrated danger. "Cancel the perimeter search. I have the specific target. The Russian safe house on Dock Street. The one we deemed inactive 2 weeks ago. Get me tactical maps, satellite thermal imaging, and the entire armed company. I am going in first." This is no longer an extraction. It is a retaliation. His eyes drifted back to the faded photograph on the desk. He felt the heavy, protective responsibility of his past collide with the lethal power of his present. He was going to save Sarah, not because of a territorial code, but because he was compelled by a forgotten part of his own soul. The mission had transformed into a crusade. The Russians were about to face the terrifying, focused wrath of a Mafia boss who was fighting for the last remaining piece of his own humanity. They had kidnapped the wrong woman, the one woman who could undo the carefully constructed control of Vincenzo Moratelli. His entire strategy changed in that single, decisive moment, driven by the intense personal interest of recovering his lost friend. He would move with a speed and brutality they could not possibly anticipate. Vincenzo Moratelli's focus was a cold, impenetrable wall. The discovery that the woman seized by the Solntsevskaya Bratva was Sarah Smith, the only ghost of innocence remaining in his memory, had eradicated all tolerance for inefficiency or delay. The Moratelli compound ceased to be a home and became a fortress of lethal logistics. Every one of his resources, from the highly trained, silent soldiers patrolling the New Jersey streets to the elite tech unit buried deep in the mansion's subterranean levels, was harnessed toward a single, terrifying objective: immediate, overwhelming retrieval. "I want real-time thermal data on every warehouse within a 5-mile radius of that dock address. Sweep the encrypted Russian communication channels again. They are expecting a response, but not this one," Vincenzo articulated, his voice stripped of all emotion, leaving only raw, dangerous command. He stood over a massive digital map that glowed with tactical data, his dark suit blending into the shadow-drenched atmosphere of the makeshift war room. The scale of the Moratelli operation was colossal, a testament to decades of inherited power. It moved with the precise, deadly speed of an unstoppable mechanism, designed to crush any threat that dared to infringe on the boss's territory or his interests. Vincenzo had ordered the immediate deployment of 3 separate, heavily armed units, but his intentions were clear to his trusted lieutenant, Franco Fontanelli. The boss was not simply directing, he was preparing to participate. His motivation was layered. The insult to his territory was unforgivable, but the fury that truly drove the operation was the realization that the Russians had touched his past. He would make them pay for every single moment Sarah spent breathing the stale air of their confinement. Meanwhile, Sarah Smith was utilizing the only weapon she had left: her mind. She was held in a desolate warehouse, an abandoned monument to industrial decay. The stench of stagnant water, old oil, and the faint metallic scent of tension clung to the damp concrete walls. Her hands were zip-tied behind a rusty pipe, but her spirit remained unbroken, fortified by the memory of Leo's frantic eyes. Her captors, led by Yuri, a man whose bulk and rough face suggested blunt force trauma was his solution to all problems, had been increasingly frustrated by her refusal to cooperate. They needed her specialized skills as a psychologist, likely to extract information from a key target or to verify the mental stability of a high-value asset, and her persistent refusal was costing them precious time. "We do not have time for games, Doctor," Yuri snarled, slamming his fist onto a nearby oil drum. The noise was deafening in the confined space. "Your son is 10 years old. A mother should comply." Sarah, though her pulse hammered against her wrists, forced herself to inhale slowly. Her training taught her to observe, to analyze stress points, to find the deep-seated fears that motivated even the most monstrous behavior. Yuri was not motivated by conviction. He was motivated by fear of his superiors, coupled with a desperate need to appear competent. "I observe that your hand is trembling, Yuri," Sarah countered, her voice low, measured, devoid of hysteria. She focused on the precise articulation of the words, lending them an analytical weight. "Your organization is exposed. You made a reckless error by kidnapping a civilian in a rival's territory. You are afraid that your superior, whoever he is, will blame you for the Moratelli retaliation that is already coming." She pressed her advantage, using her professional knowledge to dismantle his bravado. "I am refusing to cooperate not because I am foolish, but because my cooperation is your only currency. If I give you what you want now, you have no reason to keep me alive. But if I remain a problem, a complex, unique problem that only you can solve, you buy yourself more time. You are trying to survive, Yuri. So am I. Let's not make decisions based on desperation." Her calculated resistance was maddeningly effective. She exploited the hierarchy of the Solntsevskaya Bratva and Yuri's inherent insecurity. He was expecting weeping, passive compliance. Instead, he faced cold, clinical analysis of his own failure. She was not a victim. She was a frustrating, intelligent obstacle, a psychological challenge that defied the simple solutions of violence and threat. Her refusal was, paradoxically, her most potent defense, proving her strength and intelligence, buying crucial hours. Vincenzo, unaware of Sarah's masterful psychological maneuvering, saw only the ticking clock and the escalating risk. The satellite feeds confirmed the Dock Street location. The intelligence suggested a heavy Russian presence, confident in the secrecy of the location, and expecting the Moratelli response to be a calculated siege, not a direct assault. He stood before Franco and his inner circle, his decision solidifying with the weight of destiny. His eyes scanned the tactical map, the entry points, the sightlines, the escape routes. The established protocol for a boss of his magnitude was to remain safely off-site, directing the operation via encrypted comms. The risk of capture or death in a direct assault was simply too high. But protocols meant nothing when his past, the last shred of the boy named Vince, was on the line. They took her because they think they can use her. They think she's a pawn, Vincenzo stated, his voice a low rumble of lethal intent. They will learn she is a direct link to me. I will not wait. I will not compromise the extraction by trusting others with the final push. He knew the danger. He was choosing to place himself at the spearhead of the attack, a highly dangerous choice for the leader of the Ndrangheta branch. But the fury over the violation of Sarah, the woman who carried the secret of his childhood innocence, was too strong. He was going not just for rescue, but for retaliation. He needed to be the one to deliver the punishment, to reclaim what was intrinsically his, both by territory and by history. "We move in 10 minutes, Vincenzo concluded, strapping the holster for his Sig Sauer tightly to his side. He looked at Franco, his expression resolute. "No quarter. This is not a negotiation. It is a cleansing. And I am leading the first team through the primary breach point." Franco, a man who understood the language of organized vengeance, did not argue. He simply nodded and began issuing the final chilling orders to the heavily armed, tactical Moratelli team. The air in the mansion crackled with the energy of imminent violence. Vincenzo had made his choice, driven by a personal imperative that transcended all logic and self-preservation. He was going to face the Russians head-on, and they would soon discover the terrifying consequences of making his friend, his forgotten past, their reluctant captive. The countdown had reached 0. The only direction left was forward, into the fire. The Moratelli strike was not an attack, it was an eradication. It was executed with the chilling surgical precision that characterized Vincenzo Moratelli's entire empire, a stark contrast to the reckless, crude violence of the Solntsevskaya Bratva. The chosen location, a desolate, sprawling warehouse complex on the New Jersey docks, reeked of stale fish, rust, and the oppressive silence of an area long abandoned by legitimate business. The cold pre-dawn air clung to everything, amplifying the sound of distant waves and soon, the decisive tread of heavy combat boots. Vincenzo moved at the head of the formation, flanked by Franco Fontanelli and his most lethal operators. The Moratelli men were clad in tactical black, their movements fluid and practiced, minimizing noise and maximizing lethal efficiency. Vincenzo, despite his position as boss, carried the largest share of the danger, his custom-tailored bulletproof coat offering minimal assurance against the potential ambush he knew the Russians might attempt. The rage he felt, not just over the territorial insult, but over the violation of Sarah Smith, the living memory of his youth, lent his actions a terrifying, focused intensity. He wasn't thinking of market share or leverage. He was thinking of reclaiming what was intrinsically his. They breached the main structure through a seldom-used service tunnel, the explosion required to clear the path muted by tactical dampeners. The breach was sudden, complete, and terrifyingly silent. The instant the structural integrity of the Russians' defensive perimeter was compromised, the Moratelli forces poured inside. The warehouse interior was cavernous, illuminated only by weak, dusty overhead lights and the muzzle flashes that immediately erupted. The confrontation was quick, brutal, and asymmetrical. The Russians were prepared for a siege, not a direct internal assault led by the boss himself. Their positions were compromised, their defenses outflanked. The Moratelli strategy was flawless. Isolate, neutralize, secure the target. The air filled with the deafening cacophony of automatic fire, the metallic tang of spent casings, and the sharp, visceral scent of hot blood. A smell Vincenzo was intimately familiar with, but one that tasted different now, fueled by a deeply personal fury. Vincenzo moved through the chaos like a dark, unstoppable force. He didn't waste ammunition or time, his focus never wavering from the interior layout he had memorized from the thermal imagery. He dispatched 2 heavily armed Russian guards near a stack of shipping containers with ruthless efficiency, his eyes scanning for the auxiliary room where the reconnaissance suggested the captive was being held. The violence was precise, calculated, and terrifyingly fast. He moved with a cold grace, utilizing the shadows and cover with the practiced ease of a born predator. The main warehouse floor fell to the Moratelli strike teams within minutes. Franco ensured that every Russian threat was eliminated or neutralized, securing the perimeter with grim efficiency. Vincenzo, however, pushed deeper, toward a small, windowless office partitioned off from the main area. He kicked the reinforced steel door off its hinges. Inside, the light was weak. Sarah Smith was slumped against a rusty pipe, still partially bound, her face pale, her beautiful green eyes wide with terror, but still holding a fierce, desperate intelligence. The man who had been harassing her, Yuri, the rough-faced Russian leader, was scrambling for his dropped weapon near the filing cabinets. Having been momentarily stunned by the sound of the breach, Vincenzo ignored Yuri entirely. His blue ice eyes locked onto Sarah's face. For the first time in 20 years, he saw her not as a ghost, but as a terrified, breathing woman caught in the inferno of his life. Sarah's senses were overwhelmed. The noise of the breach had been agonizing. And now, the sight of this new figure, taller, broader, moving with a silent, absolute authority, paralyzed her. He wore darkness like a second skin, and the air around him vibrated with raw, lethal power. She didn't recognize him. She only registered him as the dominant force in this brutal equation. He wasn't a savior. He was simply a different, more powerful predator. Vincenzo reached her in 2 long strides, ignoring the chaos and the wounded Russian nearby. He produced a sharp, tactical knife and swiftly cut the zip ties binding her wrists and ankles. The movement was fast, but his hands, though huge and scarred, were surprisingly gentle on her skin. "It's over," Vincenzo stated, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely cut through the ringing in her ears. He didn't wait for a response. He simply pulled her into his embrace, wrapping one arm tightly around her waist, anchoring her against his rock-solid frame. The first contact was electric. Sarah felt the immediate, shocking contrast. The icy cold of the warehouse floor against the absolute heat and hardness of his body. She was engulfed in the scent of expensive leather, gunpowder, and the heavy, masculine cologne he wore. Terror still gripped her. She was in the arms of a mafioso now, but underneath the terror, she felt something wholly unexpected. Absolute, undeniable security. It was the shield of a tank protecting a tiny, vulnerable flame. Her entire body sagged against him, accepting the protection he offered without question, her heart hammering against his chest. "Who are you?" she gasped, the question thin and lost. Vincenzo merely tightened his grip, his attention on the door. "Irrelevant. We're leaving." He half lifted her, supporting her weight as they moved swiftly toward the main exit. Meanwhile, Yuri, the Russian lieutenant, having recovered slightly from the initial shock, watched the boss's face as he secured the woman. Yuri's superior, the leader of the local Solntsevskaya faction, had warned him about a potential response, but had never foreseen the boss himself leading the charge. Yuri recognized the man instantly from internal intelligence reports. Vincenzo Moratelli. But it was the cold, personal fury in Moratelli's blue eyes, a look that transcended simple business rivalry, that spoke volumes. Moratelli wasn't just collecting property, he was taking something he cherished. As Vincenzo navigated the chaos with Sarah pressed against him, they passed through the main warehouse floor. The Moratelli men were already mopping up the resistance, their efficiency terrifying. The escape was not subtle. It was a powerful, orchestrated withdrawal, protected by sustained cover fire to deter any Russian counterattack. The escape route led them through a side entrance, where armored SUVs were idling. Just as they reached the vehicles, Yuri, fueled by a mixture of desperation and professional failure, managed to fire off a desperate, uncontrolled burst from a submachine gun. The bullets impacted the wall mere inches from where Vincenzo and Sarah were passing, the sound deafeningly close. Vincenzo shoved Sarah into the back of the SUV, shielding her completely with his own body before diving in after her. He didn't flinch, didn't spare a glance backward, only issuing a final chilling command into his headset. Confirm kill on Yuri. Ensure no survivors remain to tell the tale. The Moratelli message is delivered. The SUV peeled away, leaving the Dockland silence to swallow the screams and the gunfire. Inside the armored vehicle, the air was suddenly quiet. Only the steady, rumbling vibration of the powerful engine filling the space. Sarah was huddled against the cold leather seat, still hyperventilating, the smell of gunpowder clinging to her hair. She stared at the man beside her. The man who moved like death, yet had saved her life. He was magnificent and terrifying, and he had claimed her in the inferno without a single word of consent. Vincenzo didn't look at her immediately. He was communicating with Franco, ensuring the Moratelli forces had withdrawn without casualties. His voice was all business, controlled, and absolute. The operation was a resounding success, a complete victory for the Moratelli family. But the confrontation had not ended the danger. It had merely escalated it. Hours later, the local head of the Solntsevskaya Bratva, having received Yuri's last scrambled transmission, was left with a single, horrifying truth. The Moratelli boss had personally intervened. He had risked everything for the woman. This was not a turf war, it was a vendetta, and their immediate retaliation had failed. The Russian leader, his face contorted in a mask of vengeful rage, made a solemn oath to his remaining men. The Calabrese boss has stolen our asset and embarrassed our name. He thinks he can hide her in his castle. He has just signed the death warrant for that woman and his entire family. He chose to make this personal. We will make him regret that decision with every breath he takes. Moratelli will pay 100 times over. His woman is now a target of the highest priority. Find her. Bring her back, or burn the city trying. The successful rescue by Vincenzo had ignited a far more dangerous, focused vendetta from the Solntsevskaya Bratva, setting the stage for the continuing lethal drama. Sarah was safe, but the boss's intervention had tied her fate permanently to the escalating, unforgiving world of Mafia warfare. The escape was complete, but the war for her safety had just begun. The black-armored Suburban slipped through the main gates of the Moratelli estate, with the practiced ease of an apex predator returning to its den. The sun was now high, casting sharp, defining shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns and the towering stone facade of the mansion. Inside the vehicle, the air was still thick with the metallic tang of fear and gunpowder residue, a stark, unwelcome contrast to the overwhelming silence of safety. Sarah Smith's physical exhaustion was almost complete. Her muscles ached from being bound, her head throbbed, and her psychological defenses were frayed. Yet, the resilience of the mother, the fierce, protective instinct, remained intact. She glanced at the man beside her, Vincenzo Moratelli. He had shed his tactical gear and was now simply clad in his dark, immaculately tailored suit, looking untouchable, magnificent, and entirely terrifying. He was the eye of the storm, the source of the incredible violence that had just saved her life. He had saved her, but she understood one immutable truth. She was not free. She was simply the latest, most precious asset secured in his high-stakes world. Vincenzo gave no indication of the personal turmoil the past 24 hours had wrought. He spoke briefly into his secure phone line, confirming the successful tactical withdrawal and the complete elimination of the remaining Solntsevskaya Bratva presence at the docks. His voice was all business, cold, methodical, and chillingly effective. When he ended the call, his blue ice eyes finally settled on her face, lingering on the bruises and the deep exhaustion etched there. "You will be given medical attention immediately," he stated, his voice a low, heavy chord. "Then you will rest." Sarah stiffened. "I need to see Leo." "You will see your son," Vincenzo conceded, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his gaze. "But you will do so inside, under observation." We have reached the point of security. The interior of the mansion was a study in severe, unapologetic luxury. Marble floors that felt colder than the dock air, soaring ceilings, and art that looked less like decoration and more like strategic investment. It was opulent, but utterly devoid of warmth, a monument built to power and fear. She was guided through a vast, silent hall by one of Vincenzo's enormous, dark-suited men, feeling like an alien in this environment. The culmination of the rescue, the raw reason for her survival, occurred in a sun-drenched library, where the massive windows offered a serene, almost deceptive view of the autumn gardens. Leo, her 10-year-old son, was sitting on a plush sofa, drawing intensely, his small form dwarfed by the sheer scale of the room. He was under the quiet, protective watch of Franco Fontanelli, Vincenzo's lieutenant, who rose respectfully as they entered. "Mama!" The sound of his voice, high-pitched with relief and pure, unadulterated love, broke the dam. Sarah's sophisticated psychological training, her resilience, her carefully constructed composure, all shattered instantly. She cried out his name and stumbled forward, the strength finally leaving her legs. Leo launched himself into her arms. The resulting collision was a messy, desperate reunion, a flurry of tear-soaked kisses, frantic hugs, and incoherent whispers of relief. Sarah buried her face in the sweet, familiar scent of his hair, inhaling the essence of her son, allowing the overwhelming, consuming gratitude to wash away the lingering terror of the abduction. This was the core, the only thing that mattered. She held him tightly, fiercely, anchoring herself to the small, breathing reality of her son. Finally safe, Vincenzo and Franco stood back, observing the scene with a silence that spoke volumes of their own strict protective code. Vincenzo had delivered on his unspoken vow. When the frantic energy of the reunion subsided, leaving Sarah weak but profoundly whole, Vincenzo finally stepped forward. "The reunion is complete," he announced, his voice snapping the room back to the brutal reality of their situation. "Now, the terms." Sarah held Leo tightly against her side, her green eyes flashing defiance despite her exhaustion. "My terms are simple. My son and I go home. I can't stay here." Vincenzo's mouth curled into a cold, dismissive line. "Your home is compromised. Your father's debt has been paid in violence, not cash. The Solntsevskaya Bratva knows you are under my protection, which makes you and Leo the highest priority targets for their revenge. You leave this house, and you sign your own death warrant. This," he gestured broadly at the marble, the security, the palpable silence, "is the only structure in this city that can guarantee your survival. So I trade one prison for another? A warehouse for a gilded cage?" Sarah challenged, the defiance fueled by her profession's need for independence. "I am not a possession, Vincenzo. I am a free woman. You are a vulnerable woman who cannot protect her son from automatic weapons fire. he corrected, his tone absolute. This is not a matter of freedom, Sarah. It is a mandate for survival. Until I have eradicated the Russian threat completely, you will remain here, under my direct, absolute, non-negotiable protection. He watched her carefully, noting her intense resistance. He knew logic would not suffice, not when her deepest core value, her independence, was being stripped away. He had to replace that value with a deeper, more profound form of recognition. Vincenzo reached inside his coat, moving with agonizing slowness. He did not retrieve a weapon, but a small, faded piece of paper. He extended his hand, and Sarah, mesmerized, accepted the old photograph. She looked down. The image was soft with age, featuring 2 children on a dock, their faces smeared with sunscreen and sand. A serious, dark-haired boy and a girl with an irrepressible smile. Her fingers trembled as she realized the truth. The same intense, dark features of the boy in the photo were mirrored in the severe, powerful face standing over her now. Sarah's breath hitched, the sound loud in the silent room. Her gaze snapped from the photo to Vincenzo, then back again. The shock and incredulity were profound, mixing with the terror she had tried so hard to contain. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. "Vince, my God, you're that boy." "I am," Vincenzo confirmed, his eyes betraying nothing but a cold, intense watchfulness. Vince was a name for summer games and sandcastles. That name died 20 years ago. "I am Vincenzo Moratelli, boss of the Moratelli family." The full weight of the truth, that her sweet lost friend was now one of the most powerful and ruthless mafia leaders on the East Coast, hit her with devastating force. She stumbled back, pulling Leo tightly against her chest, suddenly realizing the full danger of the monster who had saved them. How? How could you fall into this? How could you become this? Her voice cracked with pain, disbelief, and a profound sense of loss for the boy she remembered. A monster who deals in violence and death? Vincenzo did not flinch, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. "It was my birthright, Sarah. My path was chosen the moment I was born into this name. I became what was required to survive, to protect my legacy, and to ensure my domain remained untouched." He took a step closer, the power radiating off him like heat. "Now, the time for memories is over. The past has served its purpose. I risked my life, and the lives of my men, to reclaim you, because you are a living piece of my history, and no one violates what is mine. This is the new contract. You will not leave. You will trust me, the boss, to eliminate the threat." He looked at Leo, then back at Sarah, his blue eyes holding a terrifying clarity. "I made a silent oath to that boy," he said, indicating Leo, "and I made a stronger one to the boy I once was, the one who shared sandcastles with you. The Sonsevskaya Bratva will be erased. Until that is complete, you are an extension of the Moratelli name. You are protected, provided for, and secured. You are safe. That is not a promise. It is a guarantee backed by the Moratelli Empire. Now, take Leo, and go rest. The war continues, and you are currently its most valuable, most heavily guarded asset." Sarah felt the absolute finality of his command. She knew in her heart that resisting his protection was tantamount to suicide. She was trapped, yes, but in the safest cage in the world. She looked at her son, then at the hard, uncompromising face of the man who had been her innocent friend and was now her powerful, dangerous jailer. The realization was clear. She was entirely dependent on the man who embodied everything she professionally stood against. She nodded, a gesture of weary, forced acceptance, knowing that her future was inextricably bound to his dark, absolute power. The new contract had been signed, not with paper, but with blood and the ghost of their shared past. Vincenzo Moratelli's mansion was a fortress of silent, impenetrable luxury. For Sarah Smith, it was the ultimate horrifying irony, the safest place on earth, yet the greatest threat to her independence. She was installed in a vast, opulent suite with Leo, a space furnished with museum-quality pieces and guarded by men who moved with the quiet efficiency of trained killers. The air here was scented with expensive wood polish and the heavy, constant presence of absolute power. Life within the gilded cage settled into a bizarre, unnatural rhythm. Leo, resilient and tenaciously curious, adapted with unsettling speed. The trauma of the abduction was slowly being replaced by the palpable security offered by the heavily armed men who constantly shadowed him. He adored Franco Fontanelli, seeing the large, stoic capo as a real-life action hero, constantly asking questions about the surveillance gear and the armored cars. Vincenzo, surprisingly, tolerated this relationship, even encouraging it with small, almost imperceptible acts of indulgence, a new, high-tech gaming system, specialized literature on military history. These were the first, crucial flashes of humanity that Sarah, the psychologist, began to meticulously catalog. Sarah's professional mind, unable to engage in her regular practice, turned inward and outward, fixating on her environment and her captor, savior. This was the only way she could maintain a sense of control, by analyzing the Moratelli organization and the man who commanded it. She observed Vincenzo relentlessly. He was a creature of immense, frightening discipline. His meetings were conducted in severe, rapid Italian. His orders were non-negotiable. His control over his men was absolute. There was no hesitation, no apology, only cold, precise strategy. Yet, she noted the contradictions. He insisted that Leo's meals be prepared according to his dietary preferences, personally ensured the boy had access to tutors for his schooling, and occasionally, she would catch him observing Leo from a distance. A remote, almost wistful expression, momentarily softening the severe planes of his face. He was protective of Leo with an intensity that transcended mere obligation. It was something foundational, a shield against the darkness of his own world. He does not want Leo to be like him, Sarah confided one evening to herself, scribbling notes in a small concealed journal, a professional habit she couldn't break. The boss is protecting the boy's innocence, perhaps trying to protect the innocence he himself lost. He compartmentalizes ruthlessly. The family man is separate from the boss, but the separation is failing. Leo is the key to his humanity. The emotional development between Sarah and Vincenzo was a slow-burn agony, complicated by their shared past and their irreconcilable present. The attraction was a physical fact she fought daily. He was overwhelmingly masculine, his power translating into a tangible magnetic force. His presence was safe, a solid, unmoving wall against the threat he himself represented. The moments of vulnerability shared during the rescue, the raw intensity of the reunion with Leo, had forged a fragile sense of mutual trust. She trusted him to be lethal. She trusted him to be protective. Their interactions were tense, often adversarial. She would seek him out in his home office, ostensibly to discuss Leo's curriculum, but inevitably the conversation would veer into the philosophical chasm separating them. "You speak of honor, of protection," Sarah challenged him one rainy afternoon, standing near the immense window overlooking the heavily guarded property. "But you are a killer, Vince. You command violence for profit, for power. How can you reconcile the man who plays chess with Leo with the man who ordered the executions at the docks?" Vincenzo put down his pen, his blue-ice eyes meeting hers with startling directness. The lack of apology was absolute. "I don't reconcile it, Sarah. I live it. The two men are one. The violence I command is the price of the security I offer. The man who ordered the execution is the same man who guaranteed Leo would wake up safe today. I don't use the gun for profit. I use it to protect what is mine. You and Leo are mine now, by right of rescue, by right of our past, and by right of the danger I have taken upon myself, by challenging the Sontsevskaya Bratva." This was the core of his moral confrontation response. A cold, brutal pragmatism. He admitted his life of crime but refused to see himself as purely evil, framing his violence as an essential protective function. "You guarantee Leo will never be touched," Sarah pushed, her voice tight. "But what about you? Your life is a target. If they get to you, what happens to us?" Vincenzo rose from his massive desk, his 1.90-meter frame moving with predatory grace. "They won't get to me. And if they tried," his voice dropped, becoming a low, chilling promise, "they would ensure their entire lineage is erased. I have contingency plans for my contingency plans, Sarah. The Moratelli family does not fail in protection. I have guaranteed Leo will never be touched by my criminal world. Not its practices, only its formidable shield. You will have to accept that I am the darkness that keeps you in the light." His honesty, however disturbing, was strangely compelling. He offered no lies, only the naked truth of his power. This constant tense dance, fueled by her intellectual repulsion and a growing dangerous admiration for his unwavering commitment to their safety, solidified their evolving affection. It wasn't romance yet. It was a profound, shared sense of mutual risk and undeniable reliance. The fragile bubble of their gilded cage was violently burst one late night. The security alarms, usually a silent, discreet network of digital warning systems, erupted into a screaming, flashing cacophony. The mansion, typically a bastion of stillness, transformed instantly into a state of active defense. The Moratelli organization had correctly predicted the Russian countermove. The Solntsevskaya Bratva, humiliated and vengeful, had launched a surprise attack on the boss's compound. Sarah was jolted from a light sleep by the piercing wail of the sirens and the immediate, terrifying sound of automatic gunfire outside the massive walls. She snatched Leo from his bed, pulling him close in the darkness of the suite. Within seconds, the door to their suite was flung open. It wasn't Vincenzo, but Franco, fully armored, his face grim. "Dr. Smith, stay low. Boss wants you in the panic room now." The house shook from a sustained burst of fire against the outer wall. Sarah could hear the shouted commands of the Moratelli guards returning fire, the deep, heavy thud of controlled explosions, and the continuous rattle of weaponry. This was the proof of danger, raw and terrifying, manifesting directly on the doorstep of her sanctuary. Vincenzo arrived seconds later, moving with focused, terrifying calm. He was already in partial tactical gear, a rifle slung across his chest. He grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip hard and non-negotiable. "Into the room, Sarah. Now!" he commanded, his eyes blazing with concentration, already processing the status of the incursion. He did not ask her to be brave. He demanded her obedience. As they were ushered into the concealed panic room, a space of steel and concrete, equipped with communications and life support, Sarah felt the structure of the house absorb a tremendous impact. It was a terrifying sound, but the walls held firm. The Moratelli defenses were overwhelming the attackers. The realization hit Sarah with the force of the blast outside. The security of the mansion, the heavy artillery, the presence of Vincenzo Moratelli and his army. This was not a prison. It was a shield. Her freedom was an illusion outside these walls. Her only viable existence, her only guarantee of seeing Leo reach adulthood, lay within this gilded cage. The moral confrontation she had waged against Vincenzo's life was intellectually superior, but practically useless. His ruthless world was the only one that could guarantee her survival against its own kind. After what felt like an eternity, the gunfire ceased. The sirens died down. The overwhelming silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. Vincenzo remained with them for a few more minutes, ensuring the final sweep was complete, his presence a rock of absolute safety in the small, sterile room. "It is finished," Vincenzo announced, removing his helmet, his face streaked with sweat and powder residue. "The Solntsevskaya Bratva will not try this again. They just learned the cost of attacking the Moratelli boss on his own grounds." Sarah looked at her trembling son, then at the lethal man standing over them. She understood. Her psychological resistance dissolved, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Her moral high ground meant nothing if Leo was dead. Her only security was the man who had just defended them with overwhelming, unapologetic violence. The house was not a cage. It was her life support. She had to accept the boss, because he was the only one capable of keeping the promise he had made. The conviction settled deep in her soul. She had chosen her side, and it was the side of the monster who kept them safe. The chaos of the Russian attack had solidified Sarah's position within the Moratelli fortress. She was no longer just a hostage or a rescue liability. She was a prized asset, fiercely protected. But the new reality demanded a shift from professional resistance to something far more intimate and dangerous. Vincenzo had demanded a dinner, an event he coldly referred to as a necessary review of current psychological status, but which felt to Sarah like the world's most unnerving first date. They sat in the small, rarely used dining room adjacent to the main library, a space that was both opulent and strangely intimate. A single crystal chandelier cast a warm, deceptive glow over the table, which was set for two with heavy silver and pristine linen. The only other person present was a silent server, who moved like a ghost, ensuring their every need was met without ever making eye contact. The contrast was jarring. The smell of fine, expensive food and wine set against the memory of blood and automatic gunfire from the previous night. Vincenzo, immaculate in a black silk shirt that highlighted the powerful contours of his chest and shoulders, watched her over the rim of his wineglass. His blue ice eyes were steady, assessing. "You are quiet," he stated, breaking the prolonged silence that had been stretched thin by mutual tension. I had anticipated a more aggressive line of questioning after last night's demonstration. Did the reality of the situation finally silence the psychologist? Sarah took a slow, steadying breath. She had spent the day preparing for this confrontation. She knew she couldn't fight his power physically, but she could attack the fortress of his mind. She would use her profession to probe the man who used to be Vince. "No, Mr. Moratelli," Sarah replied, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. "The reality of the situation simply provided me with new, conclusive data. You are not just a businessman or a criminal. You are a shield, and a highly effective one. But I still need to understand the structural flaws in that shield. Why did you risk leading the assault yourself? It was unnecessary for the success of the mission, and catastrophically dangerous for your organization." Vincenzo tilted his head, a minuscule gesture of acknowledgement. Protocol dictated a perimeter siege. Instinct dictated the front line. The Solntsevskaya Bratva did not just take a woman. They took something that belonged to my past. That requires personal, overwhelming retribution. And what exactly belongs to your past, Vince? Sarah pressed, deliberately using the name of the boy he had claimed was dead. This was the start of the psychologist in action. She was using the past to breach the present. The woman who knew you when you built sandcastles, or the shame of the boy whose innocence you had to murder to survive. Which one was worth the risk? The question was a direct hit. For a fleeting moment, the mask of the boss fractured. A deep cold pain flashed in his eyes, immediately buried beneath layers of control. "You probe too deeply, Dr. Smith," Vincenzo warned. But there was no real heat in the warning. He was, she realized, intrigued by her audacity, perhaps even starved for a conversation that wasn't built on fear or deference. "It is my job," Sarah countered, leaning forward slightly, her green eyes intense. "And your problem is that you think you can separate the man who shared secrets with me from the man who runs a criminal empire. You can't. The emotional wall you built, the one that keeps you cold, efficient, and ultimately solitary, is based on the brutal self-sacrifice of that 10-year-old boy. He sacrificed his heart for the sake of survival. And every time you look at Leo, you see what you gave up." The room seemed to shrink. Vincenzo put his wineglass down, the sound of the crystal against the polished table a sharp punctuation mark. He stared at her, not with anger, but with a profound, terrifying recognition. She hadn't just analyzed him. She had seen his soul's most guarded wound. "The burden is absolute," Vincenzo finally admitted, his voice barely a rasp, confirming the crumbling walls. This was not a conversation he had ever had, or ever expected to have. "I carry the weight of my father's mistakes, the loyalty of 2,000 men, and the expectations of a legacy built on blood. There is no room for softness. Softness gets people killed." Vince had to die so Vincenzo could guarantee control. "The only thing that tethered me to that past was the thought of you. Living a clean, separate life when they took you. That tether snapped. The world became simple again. Eliminate the threat. Reclaim the asset. ensure survival. You speak of reclaiming an asset, Sarah murmured, her professional facade wavering, replaced by a deep, complicated empathy. She saw the true burden, the crushing solitude of the man who could never be weak. But you feel a responsibility for me. Beyond the asset ledger, you feel something for the boy who lost his friend. Vincenzo pushed his chair back and rose, moving around the table with predatory grace, until he was standing directly behind her. He placed his large, warm hands on her shoulders, the touch electrifying. It was a gesture of command, but also one of profound, magnetic connection. I feel the constant, agonizing draw of what could have been, he whispered, his breath warm against the sensitive skin of her neck. I feel the need to possess the one person who knew me before the stone was set. I risked everything not for property, Sarah, but for reassurance. And now that I have you, the need to keep you safe, to keep you here, in my light, where I can see you, is absolute. The tension in the room was now a living thing, thick and suffocating. Her skin prickled under his touch, the repulsion for the boss battling the overwhelming physical pull toward the man who had just laid bare the loneliness of his power. His hands slid down her arms, resting on the chair, effectively caging her in. Sarah lifted her gaze, meeting his, the attraction finally overriding the fear. In his eyes, she saw not just the killer, but the isolated man she had just dissected. The raw vulnerability she had uncovered was the final, devastating trigger. She reached up, her fingers trembling, and cupped his harsh, unshaven jaw. The move was an act of both desperate comfort and reckless surrender. "You're still a boy, Vince," she whispered, her voice husky. "Just a very lonely, very dangerous boy." Before she could process the audacity of her action, Vincenzo bent down. His mouth claimed hers with a fierce, possessive intensity that eclipsed everything else. This was the first kiss, not gentle, not tentative, but a profound, desperate act of communication. It was the crushing release of 20 years of buried memory, the collision of two worlds, the acceptance of her analysis, and the dominance of his desire. His lips were demanding, his kiss absolute, tasting of rich wine and the fundamental danger that defined him. She responded instantly, fiercely, clinging to the lapels of his silk shirt, allowing herself to be swallowed whole by the terrifying, exquisite safety he offered. When he finally pulled back, breathing heavily, his forehead rested against hers. The silence returned, but it was charged, vibrating with the devastating connection they had just forged. Vincenzo did not press for more. He simply held her captive in the small, intimate space between them. The moment was defining, but not complete. The complexity remained. Their relationship was now rooted in this dangerous, undeniable intimacy, yet it remained a tethered connection. The promise of safety, the constant threat of the Solnsevskaya Bratva, and the innocent, overriding presence of Leo in the room next door acted as an immediate emotional barrier, preventing a full, reckless surrender. Leo was the boy's anchor, the constant, innocent reminder of the past, forcing the boss to maintain a sliver of the control he desperately needed. The kiss was a vow of possession and protection, but the final complete claiming would have to wait. The boss had dropped his guard for a moment, but the war, both external and internal, was far from over. He stood up, his control immediately reasserted. The moment of intimacy was past, replaced by the grim reality of their survival. "The war continues, Sarah," Vincenzo stated, his voice now cold, flat, and absolute. "But you will sleep well tonight. You are mine." The mansion, once a cold monument to Vincenzo Moratelli's power and solitude, slowly, irrevocably, began its transformation. It did not happen overnight, or with any grand declaration, but in the small, consistent acts of shared existence. The sterile atmosphere that had defined the fortress began to soften, imperceptibly at first, under the combined, defiant presence of Sarah Smith and Leo. The Solnsevskaya Bratva had forced Sarah into this life, but Vincenzo's relentless protection and the terrifying intimacy they now shared had rooted her here by choice. The aftermath of the close call with the Russian attack had stripped away the last vestiges of Sarah's intellectual resistance. She had seen the alternative, death and despair outside the fortified walls. She now lived in a state of conscious, brutal acceptance. She would not only stay, she would engage. She became Vincenzo's confidant, a role that no one else in the Moratelli organization, not even Franco Fontanelli, dared to assume. Their dynamic shifted from captor-captive and friend-savior to a tense, dangerous partnership. Sarah understood that Vincenzo needed more than just a lover or a mother figure for his de facto son. He needed a mind that was his equal, a challenger to his absolute authority. She used her skills as a psychologist not to heal him. She knew the darkness he lived in was too profound for therapeutic intervention, but to anticipate, analyze, and most importantly, challenge him. She observed his strategies, reading the underlying anxieties and blind spots in his cold, calculating approach to business and warfare. "You are underestimating the generational paranoia of the old man in Brooklyn," Sarah remarked one morning, interrupting a strategy meeting as Vincenzo reviewed encrypted reports on his digital screen. She stood by the window, ostensibly looking at the garden, but her mind was fixed on the data he had shared, a privilege granted to no one else. Vincenzo, who tolerated no interruptions from his men, simply paused, his blue ice eyes fixed on her reflection in the glass. "Explain, Sarah. He doesn't fear your power. He fears your speed," she articulated, walking into the room with confidence. "Your father's generation was slow, deliberate, built on personal insults. You are built on data and immediate, overwhelming force. He will expect you to move like a hammer. If you use a surgical strike, targeting only his financial assets that he personally manages, leaving the foot soldiers untouched, you exploit his weakness. You hit the one thing he protects more than his own life, his personal wealth, his perceived stability." Vincenzo stared at her, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The plan she suggested was unorthodox, almost impossible for his traditional capo regimes to understand, but logically devastating. It was a precise, bloodless attack on the psychological structure of his rival's life. He didn't thank her. He simply nodded, his decision made. "Franco, reroute the funds attack. Target only the personal account Sarah specified. Execute by midnight." Sarah had earned her place. She was the only person who could force the boss to pause, the only one who could offer him a mirror to his own emotional machinery, and, consequently, the only one who could truly help him survive. She was his external conscience, his strategic equal, forcing him to integrate his past with his present. This was the nature of their acceptance and partnership, founded on mutual power and respect, rather than conventional affection. Meanwhile, Leo was flourishing in the absolute security provided by the Moratelli Empire. The mansion's heavily armored walls and the constant, reassuring presence of Vincenzo and his men offered the 10-year-old a sense of stability he had never experienced in the vulnerable walk-up apartment. Vincenzo, despite his terrifying life, had taken on the role of protector and father figure with a surprising, quiet commitment. He taught Leo chess, not just as a game, but as a discipline, a lesson in strategy, patience, and anticipating the opponent's moves. He never spoke of his life as the boss, keeping the criminal enterprise completely separate from the boy, fulfilling his initial promise that Leo would only know the shield, not the fire, of the 'Ndrangheta. Leo didn't see a criminal. He saw a formidable, rock-solid figure who commanded an army of respectful men and whose word was absolute law. He saw a man who had rescued his mother and guaranteed his safety. The fear that had initially propelled him to the boss's door had transmuted into an unwavering devotion. The transformation of the found home was the most profound change. Vincenzo's house, previously a study in cold, magnificent austerity, all polished marble and vast, echoing spaces, began to feel lived in. Leo's toys appeared discreetly placed in the main living areas. Sarah's books lined the library shelves. The sound of their laughter, rare but cherished, began to break the severe silence. The love between Sarah and Vincenzo grew, not from traditional romance, but from the shared crucible of danger and the devastating intimacy of their first kiss. Their connection was raw, rooted in the survival instinct, the shared memory of Vince and Sarah the children, and the current, thrilling fear of their life together. they both understood that danger was the accepted price for this absolute security. Their relationship was not soft or comfortable. It was tense, passionate, and fiercely possessive. They were bound by the knowledge that outside threats, now fully aware of the boss's attachment to Sarah, would use them as leverage. This reality only intensified their bond, forcing them to rely on each other completely. The darkness of the Moratelli world had served as the brutal womb in which their love was born. The war against the Solntsevskaya Bratva was slowly, meticulously being won, thanks in part to Sarah's psychological insights. The Russians were being dismantled from the inside out, their finances crippled, their command structure fractured by Vincenzo's unrelenting targeted strikes. The threat was receding, but the lifestyle, the power, and the danger would always remain. The story reached its quiet, powerful closing on a late night, the silence of the massive house complete and secure. Vincenzo and Sarah stood together in the doorway of Leo's immense bedroom. The boy was fast asleep, utterly peaceful, his small hand clutching a well-worn copy of a comic book. Vincenzo, his arm wrapped tightly around Sarah's waist, pulled her closer, anchoring her against his solid frame. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. His presence was her constant, quiet shield. "He's safe," Sarah murmured, the simple phrase holding the weight of their entire terrifying journey. "Always," Vincenzo confirmed, the single word a renewed oath delivered in the silence of the night. She turned in his arms, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw, her eyes, filled with a complex mixture of love, acceptance, and the knowledge of his lethal capacity, met his. "I am not afraid of your world anymore, Vince. I am only afraid of the day you might lose yourself in it. You have me. You have Leo. We are your tether." Vincenzo's stern face softened, the lines of command momentarily relaxing. He lowered his head and kissed her, a soft, profound touch of possession and surrender that confirmed their bond was unbreakable. "I choose the danger, Sarah," he whispered, his voice deep and resonant, "because it is the only way I can guarantee this. Us. We face it as a family unit." They stood there for a long moment. The Mafia boss and the psychologist, united by a terrifying love forged in violence. They were ready to face the world of power, crime, and relentless danger, together. The house, once an impersonal fortress, was now their home, built on the foundations of absolute security, and a love that was born not in the light, but in the deepest, most necessary darkness. The man had made his enemies regret their actions, and in doing so, he had found the only thing he truly needed: